Hi, welcome to The Secret History of History, the paper bullets of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted that we have Dr. Jeffrey H. Jackson with us to tell the amazing story of these two artists and resistance fighters that he explores in his new book, Paper Bullets, which just came out. This book was longlisted for the 2021 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. Jeff is a professor at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. He teaches courses in modern European history, cultural history, French history, environmental studies, and interdisciplinary humanities. I'm kind of getting the feel for a Renaissance man. He's written two other books, including Paris Underwater, How the City of Light survived the Great Flood of 1910. He's edited other volumes and written numerous articles with a focus on music, history, politics, culture, and counterculture. So I'm really excited to hear Jeff's talk. I've just finished reading an advanced copy of the book, and this is amazing, people. It transports you to another time and place that actually makes you think 2020 might not be all that bad. So I highly recommend it. And I also want to add that Jeff and I were talking as we got ready for this program about the fact that the women in the story are both very famous or unknown, depending upon the circles that you move in. I first heard about them a few years ago at a historical conference, and I actually thought that the speakers were describing the plot of a movie. I did not, it was just so fascinating. So I was so excited when I heard about the book, and I'm gonna stop talking because I'm really excited to hear what Jeff has to say today. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, thanks so much, Amanda, for that really warm introduction. I really appreciate it. And thanks so much to the Spy Museum for allowing me to come and talk. It's a great honor to be speaking to you via the Spy Museum today to talk about my book, Paper Bullets. I'm coming to you live from my office on the beautiful campus of Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, where I teach. I wish, of course, we could all be together, but thanks to the magic of the internet, more of us perhaps can gather than under normal circumstances. So I appreciate you taking the time to tune in. For about the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you a powerful story about resistance and perseverance in the face of grave danger that really forms the heart of Paper Bullets. And I'll also read some selected excerpts from the book just to give you a sense of how I tell the story. I've lightly edited those that I'm going to read today just for clarity's sake. And as Amanda said, please ask questions and we'll try to get to some of those. We won't get to all of them probably, but we'll do our best. And I'm going to try here at this point to share my screen. And I hope that you can see that.
Looks good.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to begin then by introducing you to these two remarkable women. There we go. And if you know something about art and especially about the history of photography, you may have heard of them. This was what Amanda was referring to, having heard about them in that setting. But even if you know their work, you may not know much about the story of how and why they fought the Nazis for 4 years. Their story is really inspiring. It's inspired me and it's inspired many people that I've told it to over the years that I've worked on this project. So I'm really glad to be able to share it with you today. Meet Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, two of the most unlikely Nazi fighters that most of you probably never have heard of. They were Parisian artists. Lucy was a writer. Suzanne was an illustrator who had studied in art school when she was young. Together, the two of them collaborated on what people in their own day saw as some sometimes shocking photographs. They were friends with and influenced by many of the great modern artists of Paris, in Paris of their day, Picasso, André Breton, Salvador Dali, Jean Cocteau. But their images, as you'll see in a moment, turned ideas of gender and identity on their heads. More than anything, that's what they're known for today. And if you know them under the names of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. And I'll say more about those names in just a moment. But after they left Paris and they left the art world behind, they put their skills as artists to work fighting against the German army on the island of Jersey, one of the British Channel Islands. They used their creative powers to get inside the heads of the soldiers. In brief, here's how it worked. Lucy and Suzanne created a Psyops campaign, a psychological operations campaign, designed to demoralize the soldiers. telling them that the war was a lost cause and trying to convince them to go home to their families. And they did it in some unexpected ways, this Psyops campaign, with notes, with messages, with summaries of BBC News reports, with drawings, songs, and bawdy jokes, and provocative slogans, all written or typed on little slips of paper like the one that you see on your screen, that they left for the Germans to find. In some cases, they even put their notes directly into the pockets of the soldiers themselves. And I want to start with the first excerpt that I want to read to you that tells a little bit about how they went about this project. This is the opening scene of the book. On the morning of July 25th, 1944, Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe went into Saint-Hélier to do some shopping. The trip was part of their regular routine. Outside the offices of the Jersey Evening Post, they glanced up at the large clock at the top of the building. Suzanne leaned in and whispered to Lucy to keep watch. Then Suzanne scanned the long row of police cars the Nazi occupation force always parked along Charles Street, a reminder of how heavily the Germans censored the island's only newspaper. Suzanne took a small piece of paper out of her pocket and began moving carefully toward one of the police cars as Lucy stood by on lookout duty. Suzanne stuck the gummed paper on the windshield. It read, "The cowardly bureaucrats of the police who live on lies and shameful cruelty will be destroyed by the soldiers with no names." No one seemed to be paying any attention to the middle-aged women in Burberry trench coats with bright scarves tied around their heads. Suzanne quickly attached papers to a few more windshields and casually strolled away, her Wellington boots thumping on the pavement. If anyone asked the women what they were doing, their shopping bag would provide a ready alibi. After finishing their secret mission, along with some mundane errands, they met up with their housekeeper, Edna, and boarded one of the wood-burning buses to head back home on the other side of the island. Lucy held a package of cigarette papers they had just bought at the newsstand. These papers were destined to become a new batch of notes for the Nazis. In her pocket, alongside more of their notes, Suzanne could feel the bright blue milk of magnesia bottle. It did not contain the digestive medicine, however, but instead an overdose of the powerful barbiturate Gardinol, in case the Germans caught them in the act. With no warning, the bus came to an abrupt halt, and a fair-haired soldier climbed aboard. "Everyone off the bus." Lucy clutched her parcel a bit tighter. Outside, the soldier approached each commuter. Suzanne noticed his bright blue eyes. "Please show me your papers. How old are you? What is your occupation? Where were you born? Where do you live? How many children do you have?" With his critical eye, the German carefully looked over each passenger's documents until satisfied, saying very little other than what was necessary to get his answers. If something was suspicious or if passengers had forgotten their documents, they were told, "Someone will visit you in your home." Then the soldier approached Lucy and Suzanne. Lucy recalled the scene several years later in a scrapbook of notes that might have formed the basis of a memoir if she had lived long enough. She titled these reminiscences, "The Mute in the Middle of the Muddle." "Show me your registration card," the German demanded. He stood in front of Lucy, glaring at her. A look of recognition crossed his face when he saw a familiar name, Schwob. "What kind of name is that?" The document listed her French as her national origin. She explained nervously that she was an orphan and raised by a Frenchman. "Perhaps you are Alsatian." "Maybe," she replied, but admitted that she didn't really know. Lucy stated that she had been on Jersey for some 30 years. Nearly everything she had just told the German about herself was a calculated lie. She invented a new backstory for herself, and not for the first time. As the minutes ticked by, Lucy waited patiently next to the bus and watched the soldier scrutinize her documents. Suzanne and Edna were close by but could do nothing to help. Lucy, perhaps coughing or stumbling a bit, played sick for the German's benefit, brushing off her acting skills from her Paris days when she took part in avant-garde theater productions. Finally, the soldier handed back Lucy's paper. When he wrapped up his examination of all the passengers, everyone reboarded the bus. An acquaintance riding with them tried to break the nervous tension created by the ordeal. "They have not caught you this time," she said, laughing, unaware of what Lucy's parcel of cigarette papers was destined for. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more about how they did all of this in a moment, but first I want to tell you something about their background, because one of the things that I had to think about in researching this book was, why would two women with so much to lose put their lives on the line in the way that they did? And also I had to think about, what was it about who they were that gave them the strength and the power to become resistors? After all, most people did not become resistors during World War II. Now, part of the answer to those questions, I think, lies in their personal histories. Lucy and Suzanne grew up around the turn of the 20th century in the southern French city of Nantes as daughters of wealth and privilege. Lucy's father was a newspaper owner and editor, and Suzanne's was the head of the medical school and a well-known physician. They were never really starving artists, even when they moved to Paris as young women in their 20s just after World War I to pursue their artistic careers, because they always had family resources. One reason they did not become famous in their day, even in the art world, is that they never really needed to publicize their work in order to make money. They were known in certain circles, such as among the surrealists with whom they were friends, but for decades they were largely forgotten until being rediscovered in the 1980s. Yet to become resistors, they would need to give up the privilege and the comfort that they were born with. But why would they? Well, I think there are some key things about their life stories, which, although they didn't know it at the time, would set the stage for their resistance against the Nazis. First of all, Lucy's father's family was Jewish. Although he was assimilated and didn't practice the faith, Lucy embraced elements of her Jewish identity that were taught to her by her grandmother. There were also several rabbis and scholars of Jewish life in the family. Lucy was 4 years old at the height of one of the worst anti-Semitic episodes in modern French history, the Dreyfus Affair. Now, that's a complicated story, and I can't go into the details of that, but suffice it to say that it led to crowds outside the family's apartment shouting, "Down with the Jews." Later, when Lucy was 12, she was attacked by other children in school who pelted her with rocks and anti-Semitic taunts while she lay helpless on the ground. Lucy and Suzanne both would remember those horrible days, and the memory would fuel their hatred of fascism and their willingness to fight it. A second factor that allowed them to become resistors was the fact that they were in love. Lucy and Suzanne had met as young girls in the elite circles of Nantes society and played together from childhood. By the time they were teenagers, they began a relationship that was in tension with a conservative French Catholic society that valued respectability. Most people in France at the turn of the 20th century did not see a lesbian couple as respectable. Their connection was made even more complicated by the fact that in 1917, Lucy's divorced father married Suzanne's widowed mother, making the girls stepsisters. But their feelings were powerful. Lucy wrote in a thinly veiled article published in a Nantes-based literary journal that her feelings for Suzanne were her idée maîtresse, her main idea, and her guiding principle. "I am in her, she is in me, and I will follow her always, never losing sight of her." And you can see in the image on the right-hand side of your screen a drawing that Lucy did. And at the top of that, you see 3 letters, L, S, and M. Those are their initials, LS, Lucy Schwob, and SM, Suzanne Malherbe, run together. And if we run those letters together and you pronounce it phonetically in French, it creates the sentence "elles s'aiment," which means they love each other. Now, drawing on their own experiences, Lucy and Suzanne also explore gender and sexuality as fluid and changing categories. This is one of the things that they're most famous for today. And in fact, they're not known in the art world as Lucy and Suzanne, but rather by the gender-neutral artistic names which they took: Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. I'll point out very quickly, her name in French really should be pronounced Claude Cahun, but most English speakers, especially in the United States, tend to say Claude Cahun, so I'll use that pronunciation today. They assume these names to create new identities and to cross gender lines. Claude, in particular, is a name used by both men and women in French. Cahun put it this way in a memoir she published in 1930. "Masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me. If it existed in our language, no one would be able to see my thoughts' vacillation." Gender was for Cahun situational, conditional, fluid, depending on the moment. Lucy's new name also allowed her to express her Jewishness. In fact, it was as much about Jewishness as it was really about gender. Cahun was the name of one set of Lucy's grandparents, in particular the grandmother who taught her about Judaism. And Cahun is the French version of Cohen, the Hebrew word for priest. Like many other artists of their day, they created work under these new names, but these identities also allowed the women to slip the trap of traditional bourgeois society. Yet throughout their lives, they always still called one another Lucy and Suzanne, and the historical documents are clear on that point. We tend to call them nowadays Cahun and Moore because we know them through their art, but at the time, they most often referred to one another as Lucy and Suzanne. And I can say more about the name issue later if you'd like. And Lucy and Suzanne are the names on their tombstone. Now, if you've seen their work under the names of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, you know of the ways in which the photographs depict Cahun, Lucy, in gender ambiguous dress or pose, playing with notions of masculinity and femininity, in some ways helping to invent the notion of what we would now call queerness long before our current understanding of that idea was created. In fact, many queer and transgender people today see them as early heroes and role models. Their photos deconstructed gender categories, showing them to be masquerade and performance decades before most scholars would take up these questions. Cahun put it this way in her autobiography. She wrote, "I shave my head, wrench out my teeth, my breasts, anything that is embarrassing or annoying to look at, stomach, ovaries, the brain, conscious and covered in cysts," suggesting that altering gender and sexual identity was part of the goal, and so was creating a new self. The musician David Bowie, well known for his own gender ambiguity, mentioned a 2007 show of Cahun and Moore's photography on his blog. "I find this work really quite mad in the nicest way," Bowie wrote. Now, that ability to cross gender lines would also become crucial in Lucy and Suzanne's fight against the Nazis, so keep that in mind as I speak. Lucy and Suzanne spent the 1920s and most of the 1930s in Paris, but they decamped to the island of Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, in 1937, when they were both in their late 40s. They had vacationed on Jersey many times over the years, so its beaches and its natural beauty were familiar to them. And I'll just say, on a personal note, I visited Jersey and spent some time there doing the research for this book, and I can completely understand why they would want to move there. It's a beautiful place, it's a lovely island, and it became a respite for them. And in fact, it was a perfect respite for them, precisely because of Lucy's chronic ill health. She had a number of medical conditions through which Suzanne helped to nurse her over the years. And in addition, Paris had become deeply politically polarized by the 1930s, with various groups literally fighting in the streets. And with fascism on the rise across Europe, Jersey offered a peaceful escape. When they left Paris and the art world behind, they stopped using the names Cahun and Moore and returned almost exclusively to their birth names, Lucy and Suzanne. That's part of why in the book I refer to them as Lucy and Suzanne, primarily because I'm dealing with their post-Paris years. Little did they know, though, that when they moved to Jersey, that they were stepping into what would soon become a war zone. When the fighting broke out in Poland in 1939, Jersey seemed far away from the action, but by 1940, the Channel Islands would become the front line. The islands were the only piece of British soil that the Nazis conquered, and they were crucial to what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall, a line of defense in the West designed to keep the Allies at bay. Thousands of German troops soon arrived in Lucy and Suzanne's adopted home to build fortifications, which would be used to protect the continent from Allied assault. It was so important that Hitler personally received regular updates from the islands. No dissent could be tolerated in such a strategic location. But dissent is exactly what Lucy and Suzanne did. Back in Paris, they had been involved in left-wing politics, befriending communists and other radicals. They had signed petitions and open letters against the rise of fascism and protesting anti-immigrant legislation. Lucy had written a letter to a magazine supporting gay rights. So by the time they arrived on Jersey, they had been rebels for some time. Add to that their own lives as lesbian partners lived in opposition to the mores of their day, and their provocative artwork that challenged notions of beauty and gender identity. Ultimately, all of the strands of their lives came together to not only give them the strength to resist the German occupation of Jersey, but to give them the skills to do so. They put their creative talents, their political inclinations, and their personal backgrounds into their work, and it gave them the tools to fight back. Resistance was not an afterthought, but the peak and the point of their creative lives. Most importantly, their love kept them going as they supported one another through what were some very scary and very stressful moments. I really don't believe that either woman alone could have done this work. Just like their art, their resistance was something that came out of their relationship and out of their love. Now, as I said before, their desire to resist led them to write notes to the Nazis, something that on the face of it seems small, even inconsequential. But the notes they wrote were powerful indeed. All of these messages were designed to demoralize the troops or to convince them to desert or mutiny or go back to their families in Germany. And the German army took them very seriously. For 4 years, the secret field police, which was tasked with keeping order in occupied territory, tracked them, trying to find out who was leaving all of these notes around the island. Sometimes the agents would find them on fence posts, sometimes on cafe tables, sometimes tucked into magazines, in newsstands, sometimes placed inside German staff cars parked along the street, and sometimes even in their own pockets. The women even hung a sarcastic banner over the altar at the church near their house, where some soldiers worshipped, reading, "Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater, because Jesus died for people, but people die for Hitler." Now, what they were doing with these messages was scaring the German command into believing that a conspiracy was afoot on the island, the strategically important zone about which Hitler received regular updates. Was there someone on the island threatening the Atlantic Wall that protected Hitler's conquered continent from Allied attack? The notes only served to stoke the Germans' paranoia. And I want to read now a second excerpt from the book. This is the scene where they are arrested. During a quiet dinner, a fist pounded at the door. It was the moment Lucy and Suzanne had been expecting every day for nearly 4 years. The only question was whether the Germans were clever enough to have discovered the women on their own, or if someone had ratted them out. Suzanne got up from the table, walked to the door, and pulled it open. Having studied these men carefully from afar for a long time, Lucy and Suzanne knew that they would not be smiling. 5 men stood on their doorstep, including the chief of the secret field police, Captain Bode, and a fair-haired man with bright blue eyes, who wore mustard-colored +4s. Suzanne greeted them with a simple good evening. With a surprising graciousness, the fair-haired man clicked his heels and made a deep, respectful bow from the hips. German secret police, Suzanne remembered him announcing politely. We come to search your house. Bode strode to the window seat and made himself comfortable, perhaps puffing on his cigar, while the fair-haired man, whom the others called Karl, started to run excitedly back and forth throughout the house. They ransacked every corner, pulling out all the drawers, prying into every nook and cranny of Lucy and Suzanne's lives. From his perch, Bode watched with suspicion as the 2 tired women, their faces slightly wrinkled and hair graying, stood by. Too late, Lucy announced in English, knowing that these men did not speak French and herself unable to speak much German. Germany has already lost the war, she proclaimed. Lucy and Suzanne remained calm, but their maid, Edna, panicked as the men ravaged the house. She knew everyone in the household had been breaking German regulations by hoarding food. Perhaps she worried that she had let something slip about the illegal radio. Karl came over to Lucy and stared down at her. And what do you think will happen to you? You tell me that, he shouted, his calm and polite demeanor at the door now gone as the adrenaline from the thrill of the chase pumped through him. I think that you will torture us and shoot us afterward, Lucy replied flatly, as though she had always known and accepted that this would be the outcome. Karl was stunned silent. These women were not hysterical or even surprised by a raid on their house, but were already anticipating their own deaths. I believe until that moment he had thought us unaware of the risks we had been taking, Suzanne reflected. Karl looked back at Bode, then back at Lucy and Suzanne. But we never do that kind of thing, he proclaimed indignantly. That is BBC propaganda. Lucy glanced back at him, raising her eyebrow in disbelief. Now, the notes that frightened the Germans the most were the ones that Lucy and Suzanne signed, but they didn't sign them with their own name. Instead, they used the name of an author that they had invented. They created this fictional persona and pretended to write messages from that perspective, from the perspective in German, since Suzanne was fluent. But that persona, that perspective was significant. They called him the soldier with no name. In other words, they crossed gender lines once again, this time in effect becoming a German soldier. And when they wrote notes in this male German voice aimed at the other soldiers, they made the secret police believe that the threat was coming from within the German army itself. This was, I think, one of their innovations. Note writing was not unique to them. There are many cases of people living in German-occupied territory and even within Nazi Germany itself, writing notes as a form of dissent. But most of those notes were aimed at the civilian population, reminding them to keep their spirits up or calling on them to resist the Nazis. As far as I can tell, Lucy and Suzanne were unique as civilians aiming their notes at the German soldiers themselves. The only real parallel was the Allied Psyops Campaign, which dropped German language leaflets behind enemy lines, encouraging soldiers to desert or to surrender. What Lucy and Suzanne were doing here was rewriting the inner script, what the political theorist James C. Scott calls the hidden transcript, that the Germans told themselves about how the war was going. They were getting inside the minds of the soldiers and sowing seeds of doubt and dissension, spreading ideas that they hoped would go viral among the troops. Someone I was recently talking with likened them to internet memes. If a German read their notes, signed by the soldier with no name, and believed that they really were written by a comrade, then Lucy and Suzanne hoped he might think twice about what he was doing on Jersey. Maybe he would even mutiny or desert. Now, I don't have time today, of course, to tell you the whole story, but suffice it to say that they were indeed arrested by the secret field police, as we heard in the last excerpt. They were interrogated and they were put on trial on November 16th, 1944, 76 years ago today. And then they were sent to prison and they were sentenced to death. And I want to read a third excerpt now. This is an excerpt of their trial. The judges and lawyers convened in large imitation leather armchairs on one side of the table. Lucy and Suzanne's chairs placed opposite the Germans were so large that the women could not use the armrests without spreading themselves unnaturally wide. So Suzanne rested her hands in her lap. Lucy, thinned by illness and lack of nourishment, was curled up in one corner of her chair. Excuse me, was curled up in one corner of her chair like a child who climbed in a seat made for a large adult. Behind them were 2 rows of spindly gilt cane chairs. Captain Boda, wearing a white jacket and smoking his cigar, balanced on one of them. On a table lay all the items confiscated during the raid, including their Philips radio, their Underwood typewriter and Kodak camera, 2 guns, books, articles published by Lucy's father, one of Suzanne's wooden crosses that Lucy had planted on a soldier's fresh grave, pieces of fabric, and a few of the coins on which the women had painted "Down with War" with nail polish. These once familiar things now seemed strange, so out of context in a courtroom rather than at home. This collection looks like a sort of junk shop, Lucy wryly thought. Also on the table sat Boda's fat file, which was packed with their notes. The approximately 300 scraps of paper now entered into evidence were only a fraction of what they had produced, 1/20th, Lucy claimed. Her estimate was different from what Suzanne recalled, but of course neither had really been counting. The other noteworthy feature in the room was the 3/4 length portrait of Hitler that hung over the fireplace. He appeared to be presiding over the trial. Lucy recalled the large windows of the courtroom filled with sunshine from the beautiful day outside, even describing the room as hot. What a luxury, she thought, compared with their cold prison cells. 2 large, comfortable armchairs in the front row, next to one another. What a delight. We are at the show, Lucy remembered with more than a bit of sarcasm. The decor, the actors did not disappoint us. Rather than reading the indictment or inviting the prosecutor to begin, the chief judge, Oberstabsrichter Harmsen, began by questioning Lucy and Suzanne in German about their responses during their interrogations. Then he asked them about some of the evidence he felt had been ignored, peppering the women with a string of additional queries. Any previous convictions? Harmsen asked. Have you ever appeared before a court? Never, Suzanne answered in German, speaking for both herself and for Lucy. Harmsen turned the proceedings over to the prosecutor, Lieutenant Lung, so that he could make the formal case against the women, and for the next few hours, he did just that. Lung began by focusing on several of their leaflets and messages to the German troops. One of those was their darkly funny version of a heroic song. The interrogator had asked them about it, and Suzanne had not denied that it crudely shamed German women and embarrassed German men. Lung read the song in its entirety to the court. The refrain joked, "And when I came home on leave, my wife was pregnant. Don't be cross, my little boy," she said. "The fatherland needs soldiers." This is an insult to German womanhood, Harmsen declared. One of the other judges, deeply offended, refused to look at Lucy and Suzanne. By no means, Suzanne protested. I have simply tried to show the kind of situation that would arise if a woman actually followed the directives of the party. The men at the table sat silently as Harmsen shuffled his papers. Perhaps I should have made it clear that the father of the many children the song went on to mention was always an Aryan, she quipped slyly. Harmsen put the leaflet down and picked up another. When it came time to pass sentence, Harmsen was blunt. You are franc-tireur, he declared, using the French term for guerrilla fighters or irregular military shooters, even though you used spiritual arms instead of firearms. He gave a brief summary on why their actions were so significant and why he had condemned them as dangerous political criminals. It is indeed a more serious crime, he claimed. With firearms, one knows at once what damage has been done, but with spiritual arms, one cannot tell how far-reaching it may be. Lucy could not help but think, we couldn't have put our defense any better ourselves. Even during their time in prison, the women kept up their efforts at defying the Nazis. They befriended guards, they passed notes, they comforted other prisoners. And the book is full of surprising episodes of what took place in those moments. German guards, both frightening and humane, prisoners keeping one another's spirits up with singing, Lucy and Suzanne smuggling notes to one another, tales of German deserters being hauled off to their execution, leaving the women to wonder when their turn before the firing squad would come. But there's one story in particular that stands out because I think it highlights how important their relationship, their love story, was to making all of this happen. As Lucy was being interrogated by the secret police, she made a stunning admission. She blurted out, I am on my father's side of Jewish origin. She admitted to being an unregistered Jew living in Nazi-occupied territory, thereby putting herself in grave danger. Then she confessed to the supposed crime, telling her interrogator that she wrote all the notes by herself and that the whole thing was her idea. She was trying to convince her interrogators that she alone had the motive to become the soldier with no name. But in reality, she was not claiming credit for their work as the true mastermind behind their campaign, as some scholars have thought. In fact, Lucy knew just how much of their resistance Suzanne was responsible for. Lucy wrote that it was more often me who accompanied Suzanne, she who took the initiative, which required the most sang-froid. Instead, Lucy's calculated risk in admitting her Jewishness was an attempt to take the fall and save Suzanne. If the police believed that Lucy alone had a motive to write their notes, then the woman she loved might somehow get off. Lucy and Suzanne survived the war, but they had to work hard to make sense of it. What had it all meant? After all, they did not drive the Germans from Jersey with their notes, but in some very important ways, very personal ways, their effort was a success. And it's something that I think speaks to us today about the power of creativity and imagination and persistence, especially in trying times. I think they've left us a story about how even small acts of protest and refusal can have significant effects that are hard to see until later. And they remind us why history matters, because in the middle of our present day difficulties, a pandemic, deep political polarization, economic uncertainty, we can look back to the stories of people who had it far worse, but still somehow survived. So I want to close with a final excerpt from the book where I talk about how Lucy and Suzanne tried to make sense of everything that they had gone through. After the war, one day in Saint-Hélier, Lucy and Suzanne encountered a woman whom they had never met before. She stopped them and proclaimed, "I'm so happy to see you alive." Several others also gathered around to greet Lucy and Suzanne. They were in disbelief to learn that the women had survived their ordeal. "It must have been a dreadful experience," the woman continued. "Now you must forget all about it." Lucy and Suzanne were left dumbfounded by her blithe advice. Later, Lucy sat on her bed, leafing through a stack of papers. Next to her, on a small table where she placed her tea tray, sat the square hat box one of the German guards had given to her last August as a place to keep her personal items. Other than her memories, the miscellaneous mementos inside this box were all she had left of their months behind bars. "Of all our baggage," she said, "the hat box was the only one that had any value." She determined that she would organize all the prison communications, letters, drawings, notes, between her and Suzanne. Few of the documents from their earlier lives had survived the occupation of their home by Germans. She speculated that the soldiers had used them to light fires in the fireplace. Lucy gave some papers to a friend on Jersey, and she sent a few other items to friends back in Paris, but the one with the most personal meaning did not leave that box. The memories were too precious. When Lucy couldn't sleep, she reread the notes Suzanne had written to her during their prison stay, some of them on sanitary napkins, and felt strangely nostalgic. But as the days went on, her thoughts began to darken. Lucy had always been the more pessimistic of the two, prone to depression and suicidal feelings, and her gloomier meditations in the aftermath of the war echoed that part of her personality. She later wrote about how she had become possessed in those days by an overwhelming fear that all her struggles had been for nothing, that there were no greater lessons to learn from all the experiences she had lived through: Suzanne's suicide attempt, their home plundered, illness, death. In the months after the war, they even had to put their beloved cat to sleep. Lucy likened herself in her reminiscences to a repeat offender Lazarus, rising from the dead over and over, only to witness still more suffering. Throughout the years that followed, she wrote about the war in lengthy letters to friends and in early drafts of what might have become a memoir had she lived longer. These writings were not the sort of quest for personal identity that she had composed as a young woman in the 1920s and 1930s, but were rather an attempt to make sense of what the war and their time in prison had meant in broader, more universal terms, despite her underlying fear that there was no such meaning to be made. But there had been a point behind what they did. Lucy wrote in a 1950 letter, "From July 1940, the invasion of Jersey, until May 1945, the liberation of the Channel Islands, yes, even in prison, even in secret, I wrote to encourage men, including the German soldiers, to liberate themselves." Whether such self-liberation took place was easy to doubt, yet there were occasional glimpses of something that might offer a larger perspective and a sense, perhaps, of vindication. In January 1946, for example, Suzanne received a letter in German from a POW military hospital. It was from Heinrich Ebers, one of the men who had guarded Lucy and Suzanne in prison. Surely German jailers did not typically write to their former inmates. His family was alive and in good health, he reported, and the British were treating him well. He asked Suzanne to greet Lucy and to write him back. In some strange way, perhaps Heinrich, the German guard, had liberated himself and wanted them to know it. Lucy and Suzanne had liberated themselves through their resistance work too. Lucy in particular had struggled with the question of identity her whole life. From her youth in an assimilated Jewish household during the heat of the Dreyfus Affair, to her struggles with her mother's mental illness and her own poor health, her early writings as Claude Cahun were inwardly focused and tortured, an extended attempt to answer the question, who am I? Which neither her book nor her evolving self-presentation, her numerous aliases, and radical politics could ever seem to resolve. She was always looking for more. Lucy finally found her identity through The Soldier with No Name, and so did Suzanne. The war was the one moment in their lives when they seemed to have the strongest sense of purpose and the most direct vision about who they wanted to be. Against the Nazis, there was a moral clarity and a certainty, which their earlier work did not always have. The Soldier with No Name finally liberated them to speak as loudly and distinctly as they wanted. Well, those are my comments today, and I look forward to some conversation with Amanda and any questions that that you might have. If you're interested, I've got a few other events coming up. Some of these are presentations, some of these are more conversations, and you can find out more on my website, jeffreyhjackson.com, and you can also purchase some signed copies of the book thanks to the International Spy Museum. So go to the Spy Shop and check those out. So let me stop sharing my screen, I think, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and can you see me again?
I can, Jeff. Thank you
Okay,
so much. I was getting a lot of comments from my colleagues and friends saying what a great storyteller you are,
oh, thank you.
and how much they were enjoying the images and the tales and the excerpts. So really appreciate that. We've got a lot of interesting questions.
Okay, we'll do our best.
And yeah, I'm trying to organize which way to go, but I think I'll start with, where did you, someone asked me, might have missed this, but I don't think you told us, where did you first hear the story of these interesting people?
Well, that's a great question, and I have to give my wife credit, 100% credit for this. My wife is an art historian, and she, for many years, taught a course on the history of photography, and so she knew the photographs, some of which I showed you today. She knew the photographs of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, and had taught about them in her class, and she knew a little bit about the story, their resistance story, but she didn't know much about it because really nobody had written in depth about it until my book. But we were talking about it one night, and she was showing me some of the images, and she said, you know, you really should look into this. This is really interesting. And I always listen to what my wife says, and so I I started looking into it, and so I was really drawn in by the photographs. I mean, the photographs were the first way that I encountered them, and then started looking into it. And many scholars have written about their photography. That's certainly something that has been discussed quite a bit. But when I started trying to find out more information about the later part of their lives, when they moved to Jersey and when they're involved in this resistance work, I could only find bits and pieces of that story, a short essay here, maybe a book chapter there, a few references here and there, nothing that really gave me the substantive full story. So I wanted to do that, and I started looking and finding archival material in Jersey and London. At Yale, there's a big collection at Yale University and their special collection. So I was able to put together all of the pieces of the puzzle from both sides of the Atlantic to tell that story.
I'm pretty jealous of that trip to Jersey right about now.
It's a wonderful place.
Oh, it was just that, like I said, the book is very transportive in such different ways. You don't want to live through an occupation, but the idea of being on an island sounds kind of great. Folks want to know, were there others on Jersey who were involved in resistance, and did Lucy and Suzanne ever consider getting involved with other resistance supporters?
That's a great question. There were, in fact, other people who were engaged in resistance activities, some of which was similar to what Lucy and Suzanne were doing, some of which was different. As with the story of many occupied territories, you know, lots of folks at ground level try to find ways to, either through sabotage or black marketeering or misinformation, sometimes turning, you know, street signs the wrong way, to try to fool the occupiers. All of those kinds of things were going on at some level in Jersey. There was never really a big coordinated resistance, though, on Jersey. And part of the reason for that is, there are two reasons. One is that Jersey is a small island, and it was filled with German soldiers. And so there was really not the opportunity for larger groups of people to coordinate and work together. The other reason that there was not a more coordinated resistance on Jersey was that the people on Jersey were very aware, and also on Guernsey, the other major Channel island, everyone was aware that they were cut off from the continent. So there was no way that they could connect with, say, the French resistance or de Gaulle in London, or anybody else. So it was very homegrown, and it was very sort of decentralized. But there were other folks doing things. Lucy and Suzanne, they were kind of loners. Lucy in particular, she was very quiet. She was very introverted, didn't really want to have a lot of interaction with other folks. So they kind of hold themselves up in their home and did this work on their own. And it wasn't really until they were arrested and put in prison, I think, that they realized how many other people were involved. So once they start to sort of encounter other people in prison, start passing notes, hearing the stories of some of their neighbors, their cell in the cells nearby, they start to realize, oh, actually there were a number of people who were doing some kind of resistance work. Sometimes that was going slow at work. Sometimes that was, stealing from the Germans. And there'd been they knew a little bit of that before they were put in prison, but they learned a lot more of it once they actually got to prison for those 8 months.
Was it unusual for women to be involved in the resistance and potentially in prison at the time, especially in Jersey?
No, actually, women played a really important role in resistance activities, whether that was in France or in the Channel Islands or in Germany or any of the occupied territories. I know more about France perhaps than other places, just because of my reading and my training as a French historian. But women played a really important role, passing messages, hiding escapees, doing the laundry for Maquis fighters in France who were out, fighting against the Nazis. So there were a lot of roles that women had. On Jersey, that was also the case as well. And so many of the people that they ended up meeting in prison were other women who had been involved in one way or another in some kind of these small acts of resistance. And they had a lot of respect for those women. They write, in fact, in some of their writings, they write about several of those other women that they encountered. And I talk about some of them in the book. In fact, they were good friends with one woman named Evelyn, and they passed notes with her, and they kind of supported one another within prison. But it was definitely something that both men and women, and in some cases whole families, were involved with. It was not just sort of an individual, but sometimes a whole family would in some way or other engage in some kind of resistance activity.
Were they, one guest wants to know if they were tortured in prison. Another wants to know, why did they have the luxury of prison and not sent off to concentration camp?
Right. The prison experience was, in some ways, it's not what you would expect. Because we have the sort of what I sometimes call the History Channel version of, or the movie version of what we think a Nazi jail looks like, or a German prison looked like in the war. And on Jersey, there was not physical violence, there was not physical torture of Lucy and Suzanne. Now, there were German soldiers who had deserted or who had mutinied who were being executed. And Lucy and Suzanne knew about that. They knew some of those men, and they knew about those executions because they could hear it happening. So even though they themselves, Lucy and Suzanne, were not physically tortured, they were definitely psychologically tortured, because they believed every single day that this would be their last day. I mean, they're very clear about this in the sources that they wrote. They said, we didn't expect to survive the war. We thought that we would die. So I think that that is a kind of torture. That is a kind of continual, everyday, thought that they had to deal with. In terms of why they had the luxury of prison, so to speak, and were not sent off to camps, there were in fact people from Jersey who were sent off, and there were a number of people who died in prison camps, and some in concentration camps on the continent. They didn't go, I think, in large part because they were arrested relatively late in the war. And so this was already logistically difficult for the Germans to continue resupplying the Channel Islands anyway. And so there were just fewer and fewer boats that were going back and forth between the islands and the continent. And so they just didn't prioritize their sending Lucy and Suzanne off. There was also, according to the local Jersey officials, there was also a sort of tradition on Jersey that women were not to be executed. And the Germans didn't really care about local Jersey tradition, but some of the officials on Jersey did sort of speak to the Germans on their behalf and say, you know, we don't really execute women here. But what was interesting was that by that point, the judge in their trial had already sort of submitted a plea for clemency to the high command. The high command in Berlin had to certify their sentence. And so there was already this kind of ambivalence about, you know, what are we going to do with these women?
Well, but that was against their will, which was so interesting.
Right. That's right. They didn't want clemency. They were supposed to sign the request to have their sentence commuted, and they refused. There's multiple times, over and over again. Their lawyer, their court-appointed lawyer comes to them and says, "We need you to sign this request for mercy." And their response is, "No, we're not going to ask for mercy. We're guilty. We know we're guilty. We admit that we're guilty. The whole point is to be guilty. We wanted to do this, so we're not going to ask for mercy." And so the court files the paperwork on their behalf, asking for mercy. So it's a strange and complicated. And I don't know that I fully know all of the motivations there, but it's a strange situation that they certainly find themselves in. But they are adamant that they are not going to request any special treatment, that they're willing to pay the price. That's why they carried the Gardinal with them at every moment. They were willing to commit suicide, and even in prison, they also attempt suicide more than once. So so they expect death one way or the other, either by their own hand or in front of the firing squad.
This is a great question from one of our great volunteers who wants to know if they had knowledge of the Allied Psyops programs, or did they come up with all of their tactics on their own?
That's a great question, and I tried to think about that as I was working on this. As far as I can tell, it looks to me like they came up with this on their own. And in the book, I talk about the Allied Psyops leafleting campaign, and I compare what they're doing. It's possible that they might have seen some leaflets on Jersey, but I don't have any direct evidence of that. I really, though, think that this is something that they were inventing on their own, because after all, remember, they were creative folks. They were artists. They had been drawing and painting and coming up with writing and poems and things for many years in Paris before they even got to Jersey, in addition to the photography that they're now more famous for. So I think this was them putting their creative talents, their creative skills to work, and it just sort of happened to parallel what the Allies were doing with the Psyops campaign. There were some other folks as well on Jersey who were also doing some similar kinds of note writing and leafleting, but like I said, most of that was aimed at the civilian population. The idea of writing notes to the Germans themselves, that's what was so unique about this. One other thing I think I maybe briefly mentioned it in the talk, is that they were also circulating summaries of the BBC news reports. But that was also translated into German, because they knew that the Germans were not getting information, factual information from about the progress of the war. So they were trying to use BBC information to tell the Germans what was actually happening on the Russian front or elsewhere in the war.
One of the key things someone has hit on here in the Q&A is, where did these excellent German language skills come from that, of course, made their propaganda work so well?
That's right. Well, Suzanne was fluent in German because she had had an Alsatian governess when she was young. And so she was taught German by her governess from an early age. Remember, they were daughters of wealth and privilege. So she had that governess living with the family and teaching her German. And it was something that she used her whole life. And so she specifically gives credit to her governess as the one who taught her German. Now, I will say, and I don't want to give away too much here in the book, but there is a point at which the secret field police starts to have their doubts, because they say, well, these notes are in German, but they're not perfect German. There's something not quite right about this one or that one. So even though Suzanne was fluent, there were maybe some gaps here and there, just enough to maybe make the secret field police wonder what was going on there. But in some ways, I think that stoked their curiosity and their real need to find out who was writing these notes, stoked that even more.
You cover this in the book, but lightly, people are wondering why the Isle of Jersey was kind of abandoned. Why didn't the English or the French, give more of a military challenge to getting the islands back?
That's a great question. They abandoned the island early on, and they did it largely because they didn't have the manpower to defend it. There were other things that they were trying to do. Dunkirk. I mean, there were other theaters of battle that were seen as more important and more strategic than the Channel Islands. And so, as they abandoned the island, they actually cut the telephone cable back to London so that the Germans won't be able to use it. The king actually makes a statement saying, basically sort of apologizing, we're really sorry that we have to do this. But Churchill at first was not really, he didn't want to go along with this, but he was convinced by military folks that there was really no way that they could defend the islands as well as prosecute the what they saw as more important theaters of battle for the war. Once they did that, then the hope was, though, that the Germans would have no reason to attack the islands because they would be basically defenseless. The problem is that they forgot to tell the Germans that the islands were defenseless. And so the Germans saw them as a legitimate target, and then, of course, saw them as this very strategic target as well. So it was kind of a strange set of circumstances that led to the abandonment of the islands and then the German occupation. But as I said, it's the only bit of British soil that the German army takes during the war.
Yeah. We've got a few questions about that sum them up, but I want to ask you one for myself, because you alluded to the scene in the church when they put this banner up over the altar, and I just wondered, was there any reaction? Did you find any notes on the reactions of churchgoers to that? I mean, it must have been really something, and you really, make that scene come alive in the book.
That's one of the problems of archival research, is that sometimes there are gaps, and I wish I could have found something about that, some reaction or some response, but I didn't. I just found their description of doing this. I know that the vicar of that particular church, which was literally just yards from their house, had already sort of been he had been frazzled by the fact that he had to put up a white flag, a surrender flag, in the churchyard, and there was also anti-aircraft artillery in the churchyard as well. So I'm sure the vicar was already sort of stressed to the breaking point with having artillery in his on the church grounds, and then this happens, and then this banner shows up. But I wish I could have found out what he thought or what anybody else thought. But to me, I talk about that. That's an episode that, to me, just demonstrates their willingness to escalate. That's a pretty risky thing to
and
take this banner and hang it up.
Yeah, you can picture it in your mind's eye, and wow. Okay, folks want to know what became of them, and are they buried together?
So Lucy, as I said, she had a number of chronic health issues. She did survive. They both survived the war. Lucy's health began to fail after the war, I think in part because of the prison time. It was not the prison was obviously very unsanitary. The air circulation was very poor. She writes about how you brush against the walls and plaster dust would come off and get in the lungs. And so she ended up with an inoperable tumor and ended up dying in 1954. And then Suzanne lived until the early 1970s, and she actually committed suicide in the early 1970s. And she continued to take photographs and to do some of her creative work for many years, but without her partner, collaborator. And they're both buried together. They're buried side by side in the church, in that very church cemetery where they hung the banner. It's literally just 100 yards or so from their house. And so it looks out. I showed a photograph there actually in the PowerPoint of sort of a view of the bay from that cemetery. Looks out onto St. Brolad's Bay. It's a beautiful sight. And I have a photo, actually, I think on my website under images. If you click on images, you can find several images, including their tombstone. And it's got their names there together. So they're there together forever.
Last question. Are they considered LGBT icons?
Absolutely. In fact, the last presentation that I gave was at the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco. They invited me a couple nights ago to speak, and they are. And as I said, they're most often known both in artistic circles and in LGBTQ circles as Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. That's because that artwork that they produced is so radical in terms of its questioning of gender and sexual identity. And also, the fact that as a lesbian couple working together, living together for so long, a lot of folks just really see them as a role model. And so I think that they have already been known in those circles. But again, I think that the war experience is not as known as well, even among historians and folks from the LGBT community. So I hope that this book gives more of that history to some already sort of role model people. And just expands their story and helps people to know more about them.
Well, I just really appreciate how I learned a lot about the history, learned more about resistance. So it really fed into my work with the Spy Museum. And then it was so interesting how much sympathy you have for them as artists and sort of resurrecting Suzanne's role in their artistic relationship. So really well done, Jeff. You were just a terrific writer and a great speaker. And we enjoyed having you so much. And the book is available. It makes a great holiday present. So click on the link and please be generous with your holiday gift list. This is our last public program of November. We'll be adding some more programs in December. So please, if you're interested in our programs, do check the Spy Museum calendar to see what's cooking in December. And in this run-up, if you're in the United States, in this run-up to our Thanksgiving, if you're feeling grateful for programs like this incredible one with Dr. Jeffrey Jackson, please don't hesitate to donate a little bit to the Spy Museum's Mission Resilience campaign. Keeps our programs free, and then we pop them up on our YouTube program. So thanks everyone very much for being here. And Jeff, really couldn't appreciate your talk more. So.
Well, thanks so much. It's really been an honor to speak today. Thank you.
All right, everyone stay well.